redundancies may in turn cause normally viable companies to become insolvent, thus losing all jobs and putting more pressure on the state. So with that in mind, would my right honourable friend consider a fund or time-limited mechanism to ensure that SMEs can provide redundancy payments due to COVID, thus allowing them to remain solvent and protecting from further job losses and providing some short-term stability for them to bounce back in the future?
Minister Glenn.
I thank my honourable friend for his question. Of course, we recognise the importance of SMEs. There are 5.6 million across the country with fewer than 10 employees. We need their dynamism and entrepreneurial spirit as the economy starts to recover. The government has said from the start that it would do whatever it would take to support business. The Chancellor has introduced a significant package of measures and they will be under review and will be further announcements in due course.
Sir Edward Lee. Two, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Inheritance tax makes an important contribution to the Exchequer. The current thresholds of up to £1 million for a qualifying married couple or civil partnership mean that 96% of all estates in 2020-21 are forecast to be able to pass on their assets without any inheritance tax liability. Of course, any reform or simplification of inheritance tax would be considered as part of the usual budget process.
Sir Edward. When are we going to fulfil numerous promises made as long ago by George Osborne before the 2010 election to help middle-class people pass on more of their property to the young? After all, that's a priority for the young. And while we're about it, can we hear from the Chancellor and from the Prime Minister less about high-spending lefties like President Roosevelt and more from good Conservatives like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, less about subsidies and more about tax cuts and tax simplification?
I hesitate to give my right honourable friend a history lesson, but he'll recall that Ronald Reagan was a deep admirer of FDR and quite a heavy spender in his own right. Inheritance tax is paid on only 1 in 25 estates, and therefore it isn't quite as large an issue in terms of the number of people affected by it as my honourable friend would suggest, but we do take these issues very seriously and return to them recurrently at fiscal events.
Substantive question to the Chancellor of the Exchequer from Dave Dugan. Chancellor.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to answer this question together with question number 4. The government has taken unprecedented steps to keep as many people as possible in their existing jobs, support viable businesses to stay afloat and protect the incomes of the most vulnerable. We are now carefully and safely reopening our economy.
Let us head up to Angus and drop in on Dave Dugan. Dave Dugan.
Mr. Speaker, I've previously raised the issue of the 3 million taxpayers being excluded from government support with the Prime Minister, the First Secretary of State and the Leader of the House, all of whom have repeated details of the government support provided to other groups. So, Mr. Speaker, to be very clear, it's understood that 2.6 million self-employed were supported and 9 million furloughed. What remains at issue, though, is the 10% of the workforce that have received no meaningful support to help navigate COVID. I therefore ask the Chancellor specifically on the 3 million excluded, will he provide an 11th hour lifeline such as that provided for the arts, or is he planning to cut 3 million excluded workers adrift? Because it's one or the other, and it's now or never.
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Mr. Speaker, I've said previously that although we haven't been able to help everyone in exactly the way that they would have liked, I'm confident that the breadth and scale of the interventions we have provided make sure that everyone is able to access some support. We've also strengthened our security net with welfare for universal credit, amongst other things. But I would also say that our self-employment scheme remains one of the most comprehensive and generous anywhere in the world.
Let us remain in Scotland and let us head to Margaret Furry. Margaret Furry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The economic impact of coronavirus has not been distributed evenly across the UK economy, yet the Scottish Government has extremely limited borrowing powers to stimulate demand and aid recovery in key sectors. A one-size-fits-all approach should no longer be the norm. Will the Chancellor bring forward the review of the fiscal framework, lift the caps on borrowing and give the Scottish Government the tools that it needs to invest in Scotland's future?
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary, is in constant dialogue with his counterpart, the Finance Minister in Scotland on these issues, but I would say I think the people of Scotland are able to benefit from the strong measures we've put in place for the entire United Kingdom, whether it be our loan schemes or indeed our furlough scheme. Everyone in every part of this country is able to benefit.
Show the Select Committee Bill Stride.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on HRIC's website has recently appeared guidance that suggests that those who take COVID-19 tests as provided by their employer will have to treat the cost of those tests as a taxable benefit in kind, something which is very unfortunate, in particular in respect of those frontline workers who may be involved. Could the Chancellor look into this matter, please, as a matter of urgency?
My right honourable friend, I'm delighted to him for raising this issue with me, and of course we'll look into it very quickly.
We now come to the SNP spokesperson, Alison Thewlis, with the first of 2 questions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To follow up on the question by my honourable friend from Angus, the Excluded UK all-party group launched this morning with over 150 members of this House signing up as members, chaired by the honourable member for Caithness, Sutherland and Easter Ross. So can the Chancellor tell me why he has decided that 3 million people are not worthy of support, and why will he not put something in place to protect their incomes?
Hear, hear. Mr. Speaker, everyone in this country has benefited one way or another from what we have been able to do. Although people haven't been able to be helped in exactly the way they would have liked, we have been able to put in place measures unprecedented in scale and speed, and that meant we did have to make some difficult decisions in order to implement those policies. But I do believe, because of the measures that we've taken to strengthen our safety net, for example, everyone, no matter where they are, has access to more support than they did before this crisis began.
Alison Thewlis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If you listen to the evidence from groups like Excluded UK, he would know that that is just simply not the case. To turn to some of the rhetoric of the past few days, the government seems to be trying to imitate the rhetoric of President Duterte of the Philippines and President Roosevelt on the New Deal, but they meet neither of the scale of those gentlemen's ambitions. Would he agree with the SNP that we need a stimulus package of at least £80 billion, including a 2% cut to employers' national insurance contributions and reducing VAT for the hospitality sector, as demanded by the Scottish Government? And if he does not believe that these steps should be taken, will he allow the Scottish Government to have the full suite of financial powers that it requires to meet this challenge?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady talks about scale of ambition. I'm proud of what this government has put in place and the speed in which it has done so. 9 million people's jobs have been protected through our furlough scheme. 2.7 million self-employed have had their income supported. Millions of companies have received access to loans, grants, tax deferrals. And in sum, this represents £130 billion of support, one of the most comprehensive and generous support packages available of any country anywhere in the world.
Minister Bridget Phillipson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor knows that different sectors of our economy face very different challenges in the months ahead. So will he listen to the businesses right across our country that have called again and again for the job retention scheme to have the flexibility to meet those different challenges?
Mr. Speaker, on the job retention scheme, our policy is clear. We have extended the scheme all the way through to the autumn, at which point it winds down gradually and in a way that asks for very modest contributions from employers. But I do recognise that different sectors have faced different circumstances during this crisis, in particular those in the hospitality, leisure and retail sector, which is why we cut business rates for the entire year for those sectors and indeed provided cash grants of £10,000 or £25,000 to almost 1 million businesses up and down the country.
Vickers.
Number 9, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah. Minister
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We recognise every region and community is impacted by this crisis. That's why the government has announced unprecedented support for businesses and workers around the country. This includes £95 million to fund shovel-ready projects across the East Midlands to help provide a boost to the local economy and create jobs, building on over £120 million of local growth funding for Greater Lincolnshire for local projects such as the Lincolnshire Lakes Housing Scheme.
Martin Vickers.
I thank the Minister for that, and the Treasury are certainly doing considerable support for our area, such as the Greater Grimsby Town deal. We're hoping, of course, for favourable designation for Freeport status, but the most pressing case at the moment is support for the Able Marine energy park in northern Lincolnshire. Modest support from the Treasury could help to create 2,000 jobs. Would the Minister or indeed the Chancellor agree to meet with myself and my colleagues from Grimsby, Brigham, Goole and Scunthorpe to deal with the
My honourable friend is rightly championing the strength of his local area as we move to restart the economy and make progress to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Our renewable energy ambitions will continue to create opportunities at manufacturing centres such as the Able Marine Energy Park proposal, but I would encourage him to engage firstly with my colleagues from BEIS as the lead department on energy and industrial strategy.
Question number 10, Mr. Speaker.
Morning, Mr. Speaker. Upgrading local transport links is a key part of this government's commitment to levelling up across the country. That's why we announced at the budget £500 million for the Potholes Fund. £4.2 billion has been announced for discussion with the 8 devolved mayors, and a further £2 billion for boosting cycling and walking across this Parliament.
Scott Benton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Reinstating a passing loop onto the South Fylde rail line will help to double the number of trains travelling into Blackpool South every single day, bringing additional tourists into Blackpool and helping to create new jobs, investments and opportunities. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that delivering these local transport infrastructure projects is vital in terms of furthering economic growth, assisting our recovery from COVID-19 and delivering much needed investments into Blackpool, a part of the world I know he's very familiar with?
Thank you. Well, it is a key part of this government's commitment to improving transport links like that. I know he has submitted a proposal which the Department for Transport are considering. Having been able to hear the trains on that line from my kitchen growing up, it is one I take a particular interest in, and I know it's a very strong scheme.
We've now got a substantive question from Graham Morris. Minister Bartley.
House building is an important catalyst for the wider economy, and we have put in place an unprecedented package of support in this sector. Last week, the Prime Minister announced measures to stimulate house building, including a £450 million boost to the short-term house building fund.
Let us drop into Easington with Graham Morris. Graham Morris.
Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his answer. Horden, Easington and Blackhall in my constituency need investment for housing regeneration. The recovery plan is ready. However, we need investment to help us transform our communities with new, modern, clean and green housing. Will the Chancellor invest in housing regeneration in East Surrey? Because these schemes can deliver jobs, training opportunities, green energy, sustainable domestic supply chains and boost the local economy.
Well, this is an area, Mr. Speaker, where I agree with the honourable gentleman. That's why, in addition to the fund I mentioned a moment ago, the Prime Minister also confirmed the £12.2 billion of funding for affordable homes and also the £400 million brownfield land fund to get schemes working immediately with mayors for exactly the reason he sets out.
Shadow Minister West Streeting.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Conservative manifesto promised £9 billion for energy efficiency schemes, but the Committee on Climate Change described even that, as I quote, as welcome, but not enough to match the size of the challenge. Given the Chancellor is about to announce a £2 billion scheme, why is the government scaling back its ambition when it should be scaling up to bring down people's bills, to tackle climate change and to create the jobs we need to get Britain back to work?
Well, Mr. Speaker, if you listened to the answer a moment ago, he would have seen we're actually learning from the lessons of the 2008 crash. So one of the measures that was put in place then was saw a fall of a third in the number of small house builders. And so part of the £480 billion fund, what it is doing is providing the finance to enable the small house builders to build the schemes that both sides of the House agree on. It's learning from the lessons of the schemes Labour put in place in 2008 that led to a fall in construction work.
Substantive question, the Chancellor of the Exchequer from Sarah Champion.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to answer this question together with questions 14 through to 19. Through the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme and the Self-Employment Income Support Scheme, the government has protected 9.4 million jobs and supported the incomes of 2.7 million self-employed. I remain committed to helping the unemployed return to work and supporting those most vulnerable to job loss. We will continue to monitor economic conditions to ensure our labour market policy response is both appropriate and effective.
We're going to call into South Yorkshire and visit Sarah Champion. Sarah Champion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In his announcement of the Self-Employment Income Support Scheme, the Chancellor told self-employed people that they have not been forgotten and no one will be left behind. But the Treasury Committee has found that more than 1 million people have been unable to benefit from either that scheme or the Job Retention Scheme, and that's certainly what I'm finding in Rotherham. So will the Chancellor commit to acting to ensure, true to his word, that no one is left to face this crisis alone?
Mr. Speaker, with regard to the self-employment scheme, 95% of those who are majority self-employed are able to benefit from that scheme. Also, in terms of the scheme design and the duration with which it lasts, the breadth of its coverage and the generosity of its support, it remains the most generous and comprehensive self-employment support scheme in the world.
Anna McMahon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're facing the worst economic recession in history and a climate crisis. Despite the warm words yesterday, the Green Finance announcement doesn't go far enough. Germany are investing between 40 and 50 billion, France 13.5 billion, and South Korea 11.5 billion. 3 billion just does not cut it. Yep. Given 500,000 16 to 24-year-olds are currently unemployed, will the Chancellor commit to properly financing a green jobs guarantee to give our young people a future?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady mentioned plans from other countries. It's worth bearing in mind that those plans relate to spending commitments over many years and are actually better compared to what we outlined at budget, where we outlined a £600 billion investment programme over the remainder of this Parliament, including many initiatives, for example, carbon capture and storage, the Nature for Climate Fund, improvements in air quality. So we wholeheartedly on this side of the House believe in a green revolution, and we will provide the capital to make that happen.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to pay tribute to all the small business owners in Ashfield and Eastwood who have worked really hard to get ready for the reopening of their businesses last weekend in a COVID-secure manner. Places like the world-famous Diamond Club, the Dog and Parrot, the Bus Stop Cafe, St Joseph's Social Club and the outstanding Teversall Camping and Caravanning Club. And whilst I'm grateful to the Chancellor for all the financial support he has provided, does he agree that the only way to protect jobs and businesses in the long term is by safely reopening the economy?
Chancellor.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. No support schemes can substitute for safely reopening our economy. I enjoyed seeing his Facebook page of his tour of Sutton and Eastwood and Huthwaite, and indeed all the establishments he mentioned, including a candle shop, I believe. I pay tribute to all his local businesses for following the guidance, implementing safe measures so that they can welcome their local communities back with open arms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's intervention with financial support for the arts is welcome, but freelance creative workers have received little or no support from either the furlough scheme or the self-employed scheme for over 100 days. Exactly. So what specifically will the Chancellor do to correct this in the rescue package announced for creative industries?
Well, Mr. Speaker, those in the creative arts, like others, can benefit from the self-employment scheme and other interventions we've put in place. But I think it's important to note what happened yesterday. A £1.5 billion support package for our cultural institutions up and down the country, from our crown jewels, our globally recognised assets, to our local community theatres. All of them will be able to benefit from the support we've put in place and preserve what is so special about our cultural heritage in this country.
Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Chancellor for his answer and for all he's done so far, and I look forward to his statement tomorrow as well. He mentioned unemployment. We are aware that it's rising, so one of the most important things we can do is to get people back into work as quickly as possible. And in Newcastle-under-Lyme, we are benefiting from the Stoke-on-Trent and staff's LEP's redundancy and recruitment triage service. Would he welcome that? There are areas where employment is growing, and if we can get people who have been made redundant into those jobs as quickly as possible, we'll minimise the devastating effects of this coronavirus.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. The importance of job matching is critical. The evidence shows us that it works. And I know from my time as local government minister, the innovative approach that Councillor Atkins and his team on the County Council and the LEP have taken to various economic initiatives, and I pay tribute to them in putting this in place with such speed.
Angela Riddle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The aerospace sector has already said that 9,000 jobs will go in the UK, the North West is going to be specifically badly affected if the government just sits back and allows this export-strong, high-skill, high-wage sector to be decimated. Germany have put a big package in place. America have put a big package in place. France have put a big package in place. So what is the Chancellor going to put in place to protect and guarantee the future of the aerospace sector long term?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, with respect to France and Germany, those related to interventions with specific companies, it obviously wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment on those in this place and this time. But with regard to the US, the support they put in place was to support domestic connectivity. Primarily, that is something that this government has done by subsidising considerably our bus network and our rail network to make sure that intra-union connectivity remains through this crisis.
Heading up to lovely Lancashire with Rosie Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the government abandon its one-size-fits-all wind down of the furlough and self-employed scheme and adopt a targeted strategy which acknowledges that hotel workers, chefs and self-employed lighting technicians cannot and should not be treated the same way as workers in sectors which are already back at full capacity?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, the most important thing for all these sectors is for them to be safely reopened, which is why I'm delighted last weekend we were able to meet the targets set out in our reopening plan, and I know the Prime Minister has spoken about reopening our remaining closed sectors in the coming weeks, which is welcome news, but what I would say is those sectors, the Honourable Lady is right, have faced hardship, which is why, as I said earlier, they have received considerable extra support from the government in the form of business rates, holidays and cash grants.
Shadow Minister, Pat McFadden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thousands of job losses have been announced in recent days, and many more are expected if the furlough scheme is withdrawn from all sectors at the same time. Now, with young people facing the most difficult labour market conditions for a generation, and many otherwise viable businesses in trouble because of social distancing rules, does the Chancellor accept the case for employment support aimed directly at those sectors most likely to be hit by job losses in the coming months?
Mr. Speaker, those who call for a sector-specific approach are not always able to articulate exactly how they would define those sectors and the supply chains that those sectors also serve. But what I would say is the most important thing is to have provided broad, generous and swift coverage to protect 9 million jobs, which is what this government has done, and now to reopen those sectors so we can get as many of those people back to work as quickly as possible to the jobs that they had.
We now have a substantive question from Stephen Metcalfe to Minister Norman. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government recognises the current challenges facing commercial landlords, and that's why we've worked very closely with lenders to ensure support and flexibility is being shown to commercial borrowers. Of course, this forms part of a much wider picture of unprecedented support to businesses affected, including via business rate holidays, grants, government-backed loans, and of course those in turn give access to cash to pay for rents and salaries or suppliers.
Let us head to Basildon with Stephen Metcalfe. Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I draw members' attention to my register of interests? While many tenants welcome the steps the government have taken to protect them from eviction, for many small private landlords, the rental income on shops, offices and residential property is their only form of income, which in many cases has completely dried up. Will my honourable friend therefore work with the sector to explore how to provide financial support to individuals who find they have no income and no access to any of the other very impressive schemes the government have introduced?
Minister. Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question. He'll know, of course, that we've published a code of practice to encourage all parties involved in a landlord-tenant situation to work together to ensure equity and a swift recovery. More widely, we've made available over £330 billion of guarantees through the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme, Large Business Interruption Loan Scheme and Corporate Financing Facility. But, of course, I'd be happy to continue to discuss this issue with my honourable friend.
Ben Lake.
Number 22, sir. The government has been carefully considering the potential issuance of a UK sovereign green bond. present has no plans to do so, but we continue to monitor the case for a sovereign green bond and will keep this under urgent review.
Bentley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his answer. I'm very glad that the Government will keep this matter under consideration because, as evidenced recently by Quebec, green bonds can be effective in raising both capital investment and investment for operational expenditure to further the green transition. Can I also ask that the Government considers whether or not the Welsh Government can be enabled to issue such a bond so as to help the effort for a greener economy?
Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. Clearly, the issue of debt and the handling of debt is a significant challenge for the Government at this point in time. The Core Gilt programme is the most stable and cost-effective way of dealing with the financing needs that we have. But he makes a reasonable point, and we will continue to look constructively at all options going forward and also the changing environment that exists as a consequence of this crisis.
Bowie.
23, sir.
Minister Bartley.
The UK Government's response to COVID-19 has been UK-wide, which has enabled over 750,000 people in Scotland to benefit from the Job Retention Scheme and the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme, in addition to the £3.8 billion of bond consequentials they've received.
Drew Bowie.
I thank my right honourable friend for that answer. I think it goes to show the benefits of being in the most successful political and economic union in the history of the world. But can I ask specifically about what work and support might be being given or thought about being given to the oil and gas sector, which is struggling with the dual blows of record low oil and gas prices and the COVID-19 pandemic?
Minister.
Well, he is right, Mr. Speaker, to identify both the benefit of pooling through that UK approach, but also the specific issues in terms of the oil and gas industry. And that's why industry leaders met with BEIS on the 11th of June. Work is ongoing, particularly in relation to what support can be provided to that sector, and we are very mindful of its significance to the economy of Scotland.
Gareth Becker.
Number 24, Mr. Speaker.
Minister Bartley.
Last week, the Government announced a comprehensive package to support councils in responding to the pressures caused by COVID-19. We have now provided over £3.7 billion of additional grant funding for councils and announced a major new scheme to reimburse them for their lost income.
Mr. Speaker, fears have been expressed that financially poorly managed local authorities will be fully bailed out by the Government, while better managed local authorities like the London Borough of Bromley may have to meet COVID-19 shortfalls through their reserves. Can my right honourable friend offer reassurances on this point? And if COVID-19 funding shortfalls do remain, would he consider allowing a capitalisation directive to enable councils to fund one-off shortfalls through capital receipts or borrowing?
Well, we have always taken the approach, Mr. Speaker, that borrowing is allowed for infrastructure and capital projects, but not day-to-day revenue. And that policy will continue. But at the same time, all councils have received support, including the 16 million that has been allocated to Bromley. But it is right that those address the varied needs of different councils, and that's very much the approach we've taken.
We've got Chair of the PAC, Maker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, one of the areas that local government's gone into more in order to fund their services is commercial investment. And the package last week does not cover the shortfall in that, which is hitting some local authorities very hard, with a number looking at Section 114 notices. Is the Minister prepared to see councils go bankrupt on his watch, or is there a package of support for those councils?
Well, as Chair of the Public Accounts Committee, the Honourable Lady will know very well that commercial income carries risk, and councils investing in that were cognisant of that fact. But at the same time, councils where there is a risk of a Section 114, I would advise to talk closely with the Secretary of State for local government ahead of any such decision.
Shadow Minister Hancock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister promised to do whatever it takes, and the Housing Minister told councils to spend whatever it takes. The government will reimburse you. So will he reaffirm that pledge? Because councils need certainty. Many are already cutting services, and the one-size-fits-all approach simply doesn't work. So will he further commit to the principle that packages announced by the government should meet the financial cost of coronavirus and the social need for those local authorities?
Minister.
Well, the honourable gentleman will know that the actual cost will be uncertain for some time for local councils, not least in terms of the impact, that happens from lost tax income. But that is why, in terms of the short-term pressure, we have addressed both through the grant of 3.7 billion, but also additional funding that has been allocated, including the 600 million for infection control that was allocated recently.
We now come to the substantive question from Clive Lewis to Minister Baden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister recently set out the first steps of the government strategy to rebuild and fuel economic recovery in response to COVID-19. The government believes the best way to secure a recovery is to invest across the UK to level up, whilst ensuring we create the conditions for private enterprise to flourish.
Let's head to Norwich to visit Clive Lewis. Clive Lewis.
Thank you. The Chancellor would have received a letter signed by members across this House, including myself, asking for him to consider introducing a 4-day working week as a way of helping the country recover and create a better future post-COVID-19. So will the Chancellor commit to the Treasury exploring a 4-day working week as part of its economic planning for the recovery? And will he also meet with me and other members to discuss how we can work together to make shorter working times a reality?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government believes that the best way of dealing with these issues is for workers to look at existing options available for flexible working and discuss them directly with their employers, rather than the government legislating for the entire UK workforce. But I'm very happy to meet him to discuss further on this topic, if he would like.
We now come to Robbie Moore.
Number 28, Mr. Speaker.
Minister Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I should like to answer this question together with questions 29 and 30. As you will know, the Chancellor has announced an unprecedented package of support for high street businesses affected by the pandemic. In particular, the government is giving retail, hospitality and leisure businesses a year's business rates holiday. It's protecting commercial tenants from eviction and debt recovery. It's offering grants of up to £25,000 to eligible businesses and making sure that businesses have access to the financing they need as quickly as possible. And we stand ready to take further steps if necessary.
Robin Moore.
I thank my right honourable friend for that response. I recently visited a brilliant independent furniture store, Rooms, right in the centre of Keighley, run by Andrew Foster and his wife Janine and their son Joe. They and many others welcome the 100% business rate relief this year, but are concerned about next year and indeed the fairness of the whole business rate structure when considering pure online businesses and those based in premises. Will my right honourable friend continue to review this in light of COVID and look more closely to create a fairer business rate structure?
Well, I thank your honourable friend very much, and I'm delighted to hear about Rooms. And of course, in my own constituency, there have been many businesses that have reopened, and reopening the economy is the central step that we need for our national recovery. As he will know, we've committed to a fundamental review of the business rate systems and published some pretty comprehensive terms of reference to review at the spring budget. In the meantime, we are committed to supporting businesses and have taken actions to reduce the burden of rates, which will save businesses more than £13 billion over the next 5 years.
Let us head to Lincoln to visit Carl McCartney. Carl McCartney.
Thank you, Speaker. It's no secret that Chancellors have an overarching influence across all government departments. Within my Lincoln constituency's county of Greater Lincolnshire, we are faced with major local government reorganisation. Does the Treasury have the view that for the UK's second largest county, a single unitary authority would be in the best financial interests of my constituents when enforcing forthcoming local government reform and devolution?
Well, I think it is wrong for me to offer a view as a minister on this, but I can tell him that my personal experience has been that the more streamlined, the clearer the lines of authority and the more integrated and shared approach that is taken, the more effective the infrastructure delivery is likely to be.
David Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been visiting high street businesses in Wantage, Didcot, Farringdon and elsewhere. They're hugely grateful for the furlough scheme, the grant scheme, the business rates holiday. But what they most want now is footfall. Does my right honourable friend agree that that should be the priority, and can he confirm he's considering all measures to increase footfall on the high street?
I can absolutely confirm that. The reason we've backed high street firms so strongly all the way through is precisely because we recognise the central importance of these sectors to getting Britain's high streets back firing on all cylinders. He'll know we've also introduced a business and planning bill to help businesses in England get back on their feet, and we've accelerated nearly £100 million of investment in town centres and high streets through the Towns Fund this year to the same end.
We've now got a substantive question from Sir Owen to Minister Bartley.
Treasury Ministers meet with the Secretary of State for Transport and the Home Secretary on a regular basis to discuss a variety of important issues, including the aviation industry.
Let's head up the M1 to Luton with Sir Owen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have asked ministers multiple times why it is that we have not yet seen a specific package of support for the aviation industry, and have got general answers about general measures, which clearly aren't working, as we see EasyJet has already started consulting on 4,500 job losses. Thousands of jobs in Luton and our council are reliant on income from Luton Airport. If the governments of France and Germany are protecting their aviation workers, why isn't this government?
Minister.
Well, we are continuing to work closely with the sector and are willing to consider the situation of individual firms, providing that all other government schemes have been explored and all commercial options exhausted, including raising capital from existing investors.
Joe Gideon.
Question 32, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, alongside unprecedented support for individuals and businesses in light of the COVID-19 outbreak, the government has announced a £750 million support package for charities. 360 million of this will be allocated directly to charities providing essential services and 200 million to local charities through the National Lottery Community Fund.
Joe Gideon.
I thank the Minister for that answer and for the support that has enabled charities to develop new ways of working during lockdown. Can the Minister outline how this government's support has helped my constituents in Stoke-on-Trent Central?
Minister.
My honourable friend is right to highlight the extraordinary innovations we've seen from charities in Stoke-on-Trent and across the country. We've seen innovation and adaptation right across the economy, and this has been made possible by the unprecedented level of support that we've been referring to in this session. Of this support, £230 million has been disbursed from the government's Charity Support Fund as of the end of last week.
Minister, we've now got a substantive question from Damien Collins.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to answer this question 33 with question 34. The Treasury is working extensively with employers, task forces and industry groups to understand the long-term effects of COVID-19 across all key areas of the economy, including the artistic, creative, tourism and hospitality sectors. We will continue to monitor the impact of government support on the economy.
We've now coming over to the question from Damien Collins. Damien Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst hotels, hospitality businesses and holiday parks are reopening in my constituency, many businesses fear that this will be a year of 3 winters. What support is the government considering beyond what's been delivered so far? And in particular, would the Treasury consider the request been made for the hospitality sector to cut VAT to 5% for tourism and hospitality businesses?
Minister.
As ever, Mr. Speaker, all taxes are kept under review and changes to tax are announced at fiscal events. My honourable friend will be pleased to know that admissions to cultural venues, for example, are already exempt from VAT if they are provided by a local authority or an eligible body, such as a charity, and we will continue to review the situation.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. Like many other members across the House, I met with Excluded UK this morning, and many of those, particularly in the creative industries, freelancers who fall in between the gaps of the different government schemes. The package that's been announced for the creative industries is welcome, but what is the government going to do to support those many thousands of people, including in Cardiff South and Penarth, who fall in between the gaps working in the creative industries?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the UK continues to have one of the most generous coronavirus support schemes in the world, including for many self-employed people like the ones that he refers to. He will know, for example, that the government recently announced a £1.57 billion cultural fund, and funds like that are being targeted at the very few people that he is speaking about.
We now come to Jonathan Gillis.
Number 35, Mr. Speaker.
Minister Bartley.
I regularly meet with the Secretary of State for Education to discuss schools funding. We are providing a £1 billion package to help students catch up on lost learning. This sits alongside the £100 million to boost remote education and the additional £7.1 billion of core funding for schools we announced at SR19.
Jonathan Gillis.
I'm very grateful for my old friend's answer and know that he was enjoying his time when he came to visit Stoke-on-Trent in the winter last year, but he will sadly know that Stoke-on-Trent Kids Grove and Talk is ranked in the bottom 20% in Social Mobility Index, and we are sadly well below national averages in both young and old taking up level 3 and 4 courses. So could my honourable friend set out the steps the department has taken to support further education? And would he agree with me that post-16 providers like Stoke-on-Trent Sixth Form College play a vital part in levelling up opportunity to upskill and retrain both young and old and enabling them to be better off than those before them.
Well, I know as a former teacher he speaks with great authority on this issue, and I absolutely agree with him that a strong post-16 education system is vital to our recovery. That is why we've given a range of flexibilities to the usual funding arrangements, and I know the Department for Education has set out further details on those.
Jane Stevenson.
Question 36, Mr Speaker.
Minister Glenn.
On the 20th of May, the government launched the Future Fund. The fund is an investment scheme for high-growth companies impacted by the pandemic that provides between £125,000 and £5 million in government funding through convertible loans, with third-party investors at least matching the government funding on each loan. As of the 5th of July, £379 million worth of convertible loans have been approved through the Future Fund, and the government has also made £750 million of support available for innovative firms through Innovate UK grants and loans.
Jen Stevens.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Unemployment in Wolverhampton North East was 3 times the national average as we came into the pandemic. So many businesses have expressed their gratitude for the wide range of support. As we emerge from the pandemic, can my right honourable friend reassure me this will be the party that champions innovators, start-ups and SMEs so we can get job opportunities and more prosperity in seats like Wolverhampton North East?
Minister.
The Honourable Lady makes a very good point and case for her constituency. As the Prime Minister set out last week, we will double down on levelling up and give everyone growing up in this country the opportunity that they need. The Prime Minister announced the acceleration of £96 million of investment from the Towns Fund, including nearly £13 million on Kickstart activity in the West Midlands.
Can I just say that the members are pretty upset they feel we've taken too long. They were desperate to get in, but there we are. I'm sorry about that. What I would say is we now come to topicals with Henry Smith, Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Mr Speaker, 4 months on from the outset of coronavirus, we have slowly and carefully reopened much of our economy, and we can now begin our national recovery. Throughout this crisis, I've repeatedly made clear that whilst we cannot protect every single job, we will do all we can to make sure our businesses and people have the tools they need to get through this and emerge stronger on the other side.
Heading to Henry Smith in Crawley. Henry Smith.
Mr Speaker, thank you very much. To help the aviation and travel sectors recover from the negative impact of COVID-19, will my right honourable friend consider suspending air passenger duty until at least the end of summer 2021?
Chancellor.
Mr Speaker, my honourable friend, as always, is a champion for the industry and knows how important it is to the UK economy. What I can tell him is that at Budget we committed to a consultation on aviation tax reform, and we remain committed to that and will bring forward the timing in due course.
We now come to Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Annalise Dodds.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Chancellor stated earlier that the job retention scheme is being wound down from the autumn. It's actually being wound down from the start of next month across all sectors at the same time, and we're already seeing the impact of that in very substantial redundancies. The Resolution Foundation called this week for a targeted continuation of the scheme for the hardest hit industries and those areas affected by additional lockdowns. The Chancellor said he doesn't want to pick winners, but this health crisis has involved governments designating losers, quite rightly, for public health reasons. So why is he persisting with his one-size-fits-all removal of the job retention scheme when this will inevitably lead to additional redundancies? Thank you.
Chancellor.
Mr Speaker, this is not about picking winners or losers. This is about protecting people's health. And where it is incumbent on the government to step in and make sure that we can protect people's health through targeted interventions, that will remain the right thing to do. With regard to economic support, my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary has made clear that support has been provided to the local council, whether this has been the place. And with regard to the furlough scheme, we are in the belief, rightly, that this is a universal scheme. It is generous, it has been extended to October, and it is winding down in a gradual and temperate manner.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I have to say it's disappointing to hear that the Chancellor is not budging from this position. As mentioned, it's already leading to additional waves of redundancies, avoidable redundancies in many cases. Now, Labour has repeatedly called on government to match the ambitions of Labour's previous Future Jobs Fund in developing support for unemployed young people. So can I ask the Chancellor why, put together, the Traineeship Fund and Green Jobs Challenge Fund, just announced, amount to less than a quarter of the size of the Future Jobs Fund? That hardly reflects a focus on jobs, jobs, jobs.
Chancellor.
I'm not quite sure that's right, Mr. Speaker. The Future Jobs Fund, I think, in reality was about £1 billion. We announced yesterday a £2 billion Green Home Grant to provide home efficiency upgrades for hundreds of thousands of homes to create tens of thousands in jobs up and down this country, where households can not only save money on their electricity bills and save carbon, but also create good local jobs in the process.
Laura Files.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From a health perspective, COVID-19 disproportionately affected the old. But from an economic perspective, the risks are greatest for the young, both in lost employment opportunities and potentially a future higher tax burden. What reassurances can my right honourable friend give that the economic prospects of young people will be his priority in the future recovery?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. Young people are more likely than not to work in affected sectors. They are more likely than others to be furloughed. And we know from all the evidence that the impact of scarring on young people is very significant, and which is why they remain uppermost in my mind. And I can give her that reassurance that they will be prioritised as we think about our recovery and our labour market interventions.
We're returning to visit Margaret Farrier again. Margaret Farrier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The TB in Cambuslang in my constituency responsibly took out business interruption insurance, including notifiable diseases cover. The one time that they've had to claim is during the coronavirus pandemic, but they've been refused because COVID-19 is not on this list of notifiable diseases. Many other businesses have found themselves in the same position and understandably feel frustrated that insurers have not helped them in their time of need. What discussions are the Treasury having with the FCA to remedy this situation?
Minister.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question, and as she will know, the Treasury is in constant communication with the FCA on these and other issues. If she would like to bring the specific details to my attention, I'll make sure that they are examined by ministers.
Douglas Ross.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Our coach industry is going to be vital as the country opens up and we begin our recovery from COVID-19. Local Murray firm Mains of Buckie and owner Kevin Main have been leading calls for a bespoke deal to support the coach industry. Is this something the Treasury will look at and consider?
Well, I'm sure he understands that, of course, the desire for bespoke deals across every sector is extremely great. Our view has been that actually what's required is to lift all boats by a general support for the economy, and that is the approach we've taken, and that is why the interventions that we've made so far include almost £300 billion of guarantees, roughly 15% of UK GDP.
Tim Farron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Saturday, we proudly reopened hospitality and tourism safely in Cumbria, which is our largest employer. But 69% of hospitality industry businesses will not be able to fully reopen. And having lost most of the season, the industry will see hundreds of successful businesses fail and tens of thousands of jobs lost unless the Chancellor agrees to a package of grant and wage support in the budget statement tomorrow. Will he do that?
Minister.
Well, as he'll be aware, there's an enormous amount of support already in the system. I'm delighted that shops and other organisations are opening up in his constituency. We look to see more of that over time as this support feeds through into the system.
Heading to Hurlow with Robert Halfon. Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that beauty salons, tanning salons and nail bars such as Salon 112 and Shui Tanning and Beauty based in my constituency of Harlow are important small businesses and often the lifeblood of our local economy? They should be supported, allowed to open and not denigrated. Will he ensure that when he cuts taxes, businesses like these will be a top priority given the struggles they have had to face?
Minister.
Well, no one who knows my beautiful friend would be surprised that he knows these beauty salons as well as he does, and I salute him for it. On the serious point, he's absolutely right about the importance of these businesses to all of our constituencies. He didn't mention it, but he also should mention that many of these are run and staffed by women, and it's very important that we should pay attention to the equalities impact of that. The key thing is that we get these businesses open, and that is what the Treasury is focused on, including beauty salons.
Meg Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we all know that there's huge problems in culture and theatre. The Hackney Empire, 120 years serving residents in Hackney, Grey Eye Theatre Company in my constituency, which works with disabled artists. And it's great that there's been an announcement about support, but if you do the maths, it's quite a lot of organisations needing this money, and the Secretary of State for Culture has talked about supporting the main gems. So when will those local theatre companies know how much money they're going to get, and when will they get the cash?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad that the announcement we made yesterday was warmly welcomed across the cultural sector by institutions large and small. I can assure the Honourable Lady this is not just a support package for large institutions, it is a support package that will find its way to all our local cultural institutions that provide such an important part of our local communities, and I know that the Culture Secretary and his team will be here just after this to answer further questions.
Chris Graver. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also thank the Chancellor for yesterday's announcement? Very welcome. Could I, though, ask him to bear in mind those freelancers and those with other forms of employment in the sector who continue to struggle as he plans tomorrow and going forward. But, Mr. Speaker, we need to move ahead with a green recovery. Could I ask the Chancellor to consider providing additional incentives to develop a hydrogen infrastructure in this country? I don't believe we can achieve our emissions objectives just with battery technology. We're going to need hydrogen vehicles as well. This government really needs to do a lot to encourage the development of such an infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, I agree wholeheartedly with my right honourable friend that we should make getting to our net zero commitments at the heart of our recovery. He will have seen the announcement we recently made about green homes grants, showing our commitment in this area. But I know he has a lot of experience with regard to hydrogen and transportation. I look forward to getting those thoughts from him so we can incorporate it into our future plans.
Erin Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. More young people need a college place. More young people need help with catch-up. More adults need retraining. City of Bristol College and colleges such as St Brendan's in Bristol are perfectly placed and ready to help, but the Chancellor needs to help them. So will he commit to extending the COVID £1 billion to post-16 to catch up? And will he commit to ensuring that every 16 to 19-year-old has a funded place at a college from September?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I agree with the honourable member about the importance of post-16 education and further education, which is why I was delighted at budget to announce a £400 million increase in post-16 education, a record increase in per-pupil funding compared to the last several years, and indeed the Prime Minister also talked about our commitment to upgrade the entire FE College estate across the United Kingdom.
Dr. Kieran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of all my constituents who contacted me about this, can I thank my right honourable friend for listening to organisations like the Lyceum Theatre and Crew in coming up with this vital £1.57 billion package for arts and culture. Can I ask what the timetable might be for making these crucial funds available?
Chancellor.
I know my honourable friend is a proud champion of his local theatre, the Lyceum in Crewe, and I know he will be warmly welcoming the announcement made. What I can tell him is the Culture Secretary's team will be here just after us, but we share with him an ambition to ensure that this support reaches all the relevant institutions as quickly as prudently possible.
Let us nip over to Edmonton to see Kate Osmore. Kate Osmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Credit unions are known for offering those on low incomes an alternative access to credit. But due to COVID-19, during the months of April and May, North London Credit Union and Enfield have been hard hit, and they have seen 87.5% fall in the number of loans issued. So will the Chancellor use his summer statement to announce financial support for credit unions who are challenged with branch closures and possible bankruptcy?
Minister.
Well, I entirely agree with the Honourable Lady about the importance of credit unions. I'm a member of Moneybox Credit Union in Hereford, and I can vouch for their importance, especially to people on low incomes. I think she makes a very valid point, and it's one that we'll continue to consider as we move forward.
We now come to Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For too long, Ashfield has been left behind, and my constituents wait with anticipation for the Chancellor's financial statement tomorrow. My constituents care about infrastructure, roads, rail transport, the town centre fund and future high streets funding. Can my right honourable friend please assure me that Ashfield will be prioritised as we begin the process of levelling up across the country?
Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, as the Prime Minister said last week, we're doubling down on levelling up, and he committed last week to 95 million to the East Midlands for shovel-ready projects, and that is in addition to the 10.25 million of accelerated funding from the Towns Fund for Kirby in Ashfield. But I look forward to working with him on his commitment to levelling up his constituency.
We now come to Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's been a pleasure to meet the young entrepreneurs in Hull. Many of these young people have faced great adversity before setting up their own businesses, but they have had no income, no support and no grants from the government. Have these young people been forgotten?
Chancellor.
Mr Speaker, these young people have absolutely not been forgotten, and we remain indebted to them for their dynamism in helping to power our recovery. I'm delighted that our Startup Loan Scheme has recently been expanded and is able to provide cash loans to those budding entrepreneurs in her constituency and others, and I would urge them to have a look at it and see if it will help fund their plans.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safer arrival of those participating next, I am suspending the House for 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Order. Order. I have a short statement to make about the conduct of divisions. I believe that all members are now familiar with the process and the Chair will not give reminders of it before each division. The doors will generally be locked 12 minutes after the start of the division, although the Chair retains the discretion to extend that period if need be. Right, I now call Jonathan Ashworth to ask his urgent question.
Ask the Secretary of State for Health to update the House on its response to the coronavirus pandemic.
Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We are bringing coronavirus under control. Yesterday's figures showed 352 new cases, the lowest since lockdown began, and that's down from over 5,000 a day at the peak. 209 patients are currently in mechanical ventilator beds with coronavirus, down from 3,300 at the peak. The latest number of deaths recorded in all settings in the UK was 16. New figures this morning show that for the last 2 weeks, the number of people who've died from all causes has been lower than the normal average for this time of year. And because we're bringing the virus under control, we've been able to restore some of the things that make life worth living. This weekend, restaurants, pubs and hairdressers were buzzing with activity for the first time in months. And yesterday we were able to ease restrictions for the 2.2 million people who've been shielding across England, so they can now spend more time outdoors in a group of up to 6, whilst maintaining, of course, social distancing, Mr. Speaker. Our plan has always been to lift the national lockdown while taking ever more targeted action to suppress the virus. We're seeing a similar approach in other countries like Germany, Spain, and Australia, where overnight they locked down Melbourne. We took last week difficult but vital decisions about Leicester. Since then, we've been working with Leicester and Leicestershire, and I'm pleased to say that together we have brought down the 7-day infection rate from 135 to 117 cases per 100,000 people. Mr. Speaker, in reopening hospitality, we've also introduced contact tracing for customers. This system is working. I want to thank all those who are making the system work and pay tribute in particular to 3 pubs that have taken specific action: the Lighthouse in Burnham-on-Sea, the Fox and Hounds in Batley, and the Village Home in Gosport. They have all closed for a deep clean and staff testing after in each case a customer had tested positive. They are doing the right thing by their customers and by their communities. This is NHS test and trace working precisely as intended. 3 pubs shut so others can be open. And I think the whole House is grateful. Mr. Speaker, coronavirus has been the worst global pandemic in a generation. Here, we protected the NHS, we built the new Nightingale hospitals in 10 days. At all times, treatment was available for all. Our medical researchers discovered the only drug known to work. We've built from scratch almost one of the biggest testing capabilities in the world. We're getting coronavirus cornered, but this is no time to lose our resolve. The virus exists only to spread, so we must all stay alert and enjoy summer safely.
Jonathan Ashworth.
I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for that answer. He's quite right. We are through the peak, but we must not be remotely complacent. There's thousands and thousands could still die from this virus over the coming months into next year. On the point about Leicester, I obviously welcome that news about Leicester, and I'm grateful for the way in which he and his officials have kept me updated. Could I just ask him, what is the exit strategy for Leicester? How does an area that has gone into a local lockdown escape from a local lockdown? In Germany, I understand local lockdowns are lifted at around 50 cases per 100,000. Will he be applying similar criteria here in the United Kingdom? I think people in Leicester and potentially other towns and cities that could go into lockdown would welcome that clarity today. Of course, the Pillar 2 data has been an issue of some contention, but much of it has now been delivered. But there are still complaints that the way in which the data set has been delivered is incomplete. Directors of Public Health need Pillar 2 community data in real time on a daily basis. They need total number of tests undertaken, as well as those that are just positive, and they need patient identifiable data so they can put in place the extensive contact tracing needed to keep all of our constituents safe. In Leicester, there's been speculation that the textile trade or food manufacturing has been responsible for the outbreak, although we still don't actually know why we had that outbreak in Leicester. But many of these places where there have been outbreaks, whether it's Kirklees or elsewhere, have usually been characterised by low pay, insecure work and lack of decent sick pay. So can I ask him to, again, to look again at sick pay entitlements, because people will not isolate unless they're given that financial security. And finally, he said that yesterday, or rather, Mr. Speaker, on Sunday, he said that asymmetric transmission is a problem. Totally asymptomatic, asymptomatic transmission is a problem. We agree. Could he explain why he's not routinely testing healthcare workers? We've now got a position in this country where Premiership footballers are tested twice a week, but NHS staff are not routinely tested. And finally, on care homes. The initial guidance from the government downplayed the risks to care homes. Care providers were sent conflicting guidance throughout this outbreak. Staff could not access testing until mid-April and are still not tested routinely. PPE supplies have been inadequate. Thousands of families have lost their loved ones in care homes to this disease. Care workers themselves have died on the front line. Can he understand why people are so insulted by the Prime Minister's remarks when he said too many care homes didn't really follow the procedures? Can he appreciate the hurt that has led to care home providers today, for example, describing the comments as clumsy and cowardly? And can he tell us, therefore, which care homes didn't follow procedures and what these procedures were that apparently were not followed? And will he take this opportunity now to apologise for the Prime Minister's crass remarks?
Secretary of State. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, on Leicester, he asks rightly about the process needed to bring Leicester out of lockdown and bring it back to the level of freedom that's enjoyed in the rest of the country. And what we said when we took the measures just over a week ago is that we needed to see 14 days of data. And so we propose to make announcements on the next steps on the 18th of July. Of course, if further measures are needed in the meantime to tighten up, then we would take them immediately. But as I said in my statement, the good news is that the data are currently moving in the right direction. He asked specifically about a figure for the point at which such a local lockdown might be lifted. We're not going to use or give a specific figure, because both the level and the rate of change matters. If the level were lower but it was going up, that could be a worse situation than a higher level that is under control and falling. So you've got to look at both the level and the rate of change. I'm glad that he said that data is being delivered. He mentioned some more detailed data, and I'm very happy to look into those proposals. He mentioned asymptomatic testing and the asymptomatic testing of NHS staff. As this House debated 10 days ago now, Mr. Speaker, we have worked with clinicians to come forward with a scheme that is supported by those clinicians for the regular testing of NHS staff. That scheme is now agreed and in place. And of course, we constantly monitor it. And we monitor the number of cases amongst NHS staff, and I'm content with that scheme that was set out almost 2 weeks ago. He also asked about care homes, and throughout this crisis, care homes have done amazing work. And the Prime Minister was explaining that because asymptomatic transmission was not known about, the correct procedures were therefore not known, and we've been constantly learning about this virus from the start and improving procedures all the way through. And I pay tribute to the care homes of this country who've done so much to care for the most vulnerable throughout this crisis.
We now come to the Chair of the Select Committee, Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Regis Chair of Medicine of Oxford University, Professor Sir John Bell, told the Science Select Committee last week that saturation testing of NHS hospital staff was an absolute requirement and should have happened from the get-go. Last week, the Health Secretary delighted the social care sector by announcing that care home staff would be tested weekly. Now is his chance to delight not just Sir John Bell, but 1.4 million people in the NHS by saying that from the start of next
month, they too can have weekly testing. Will he do it?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, as I just mentioned, we have put in place the procedures for regular testing of NHS staff, and those procedures are underlined by the clinical analysis. There's a difference between social care and NHS staff, not least that the impact of this disease in terms of the prevalence of coronavirus has been higher amongst social care staff in care homes. We've got to make sure that these decisions are clinically led, but of course I keep it under review and take the chair of the Select Committee's comments very seriously.
Let us call in on the SNP spokesperson, Dr. Philippa Whitford. Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome that the UK government website has now been corrected to add the 80,000 missing COVID cases in England and give a more accurate picture of the epidemic. Compared with Scotland, England currently has 6 times the number of new cases per head of population and 9 times the deaths. Even without a second wave, it's estimated this current level of COVID infections would lead to 27,000 additional deaths by next spring. Does the Secretary of State consider that level acceptable? Scotland, Northern Ireland and the Republic are following COVID elimination strategies to drive down circulating virus and reduce the risk of repeated lockdowns. Can he explain what his strategy is going forward?
Secretary of State.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, our strategy is to drive this virus right down. And as I said in my opening statement, we've now seen in the latest figures just 352 new cases recorded in the previous 24-hour period. We've been working very closely with the Scottish Government, giving them as much support as we can, for instance, to get their testing up and running. And I'm very glad that right across the UK we're succeeding in making sure that this virus is increasingly under control.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Can my right honourable friend give any encouragement that beauty salons will be allowed to open in the reasonably near future? And does he share my concern and indeed disappointment that even though campsites are now allowed to reopen, the company in charge of them in the New Forest is threatening to keep them closed until the spring of next year?
Secretary of State.
Well, my right honourable friend, the Business Secretary, is working closely with the beauty industry on how that industry can open in a COVID secure way. Of course, taking into account the clinical advice. We have, though, been able to change the advice to allow for the reopening of campsites. I'm personally very pleased about that, and I think it will help lots of families to enjoy summer safely. So it is disappointing to hear of a blanket approach taken to not having any camping in the New Forest, where I went camping as a child. And enjoyed very much. Now, of course, at a campsite, you've got to be particularly careful of the shared facilities to make sure they're cleaned properly, but there is a way to open campsites safely and securely, and I know that doing that in the New Forest and everywhere else would help people to enjoy summer safely.
Let's head up to Saddleworth and drop in on Debbie Abrahams. Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Health Secretary's comments on Sunday suggesting that my Greater Manchester public health colleagues needed help in interpreting the Pillar 2 data they received from centrally contracted private labs was nothing short of insulting. These people are some of the most talented, dedicated and professional that I've had the privilege to work with. They don't need help, they need timely, patient identifiable and complete data, which they have not been getting. So instead of trying to shift the blame for the government's mess in handling the COVID crisis onto our amazing public health teams and care home staff, what is the Health Secretary doing to ensure they get these data? And why isn't he going to announce local thresholds for easing and reinstating lockdowns, as Germany and other countries have done? And finally, will he apologise for his patronising remarks to my public health colleagues?
Speaker, I will not allow a divisive approach to tackling this crisis. We will all work together. And we work together with local authorities, we work together with local mayors, we work together with local areas, and we will do that in Manchester and across the board. And I just hope that the Honourable Lady will take the message back to Manchester how keen we are to work collegiately and together. And I think that that is the right way forward. I've already answered the question on the thresholds for changes to local lockdowns. You have to apply judgment, and again, we do this in consultation with and working hand in glove with the local area. Finally, on the data point, I think she might want to have a word with her friend, the Shadow Secretary of State, because he was right to acknowledge that the sharing of this sort of data, which is a complicated task, is constantly improving.
We now head from Greater Manchester down to Derbyshire with Nigel Mills. Nigel Mills.
Is there more that we can do to help dental practices who are struggling with the need to see fewer patients and with increased costs to provide all the PPE? Many local dental practices are telling me that they'll struggle to survive until they get back to normal volumes if they can't have some help with their increased costs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, my honourable friend raises a really important point. The cost of PPE is a significant extra cost right across the health and care system. Dentists that are on NHS contracts have, of course, had those contracts paid throughout, even when routine dentistry wasn't open. I'm really glad we managed to get routine dentistry open, and we're working with dentists and their representatives to try to make sure that we tackle the real-world challenge of how do you have high-quality, safe dentistry in a way that can ensure that dentist practice can also be financially sustainable. It's a very challenging problem, and I pay tribute to the dentists who are working with us on it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Health Secretary agree with the Prime Minister's despicable comments blaming care workers for the huge death toll in care homes, or will he admit that his government's own failings left these low-paid and undervalued carers with little or no protective clothing, many without access to sick pay, fighting a losing battle against this awful disease at the height of the pandemic?
Mr. Speaker, I've been clear that throughout we've been learning about this virus and learning how best to deal with it. And my admiration for those who work in social care is second to none. And one of the good things about this crisis is that it's shown to the whole country how much we value not just those who work in the NHS, but those who work right across social care, caring for the most vulnerable.
Sarah.
Mr. Speaker, cancer takes the lives of loved ones far too early, including that of my father. The pandemic has made it very difficult for people to access necessary treatment. Can my right honourable friend reassure me that everything will be done that can be done to make sure those that need treatment get it soon?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. This is an incredibly important point. And when people talk about the lives that have sadly been lost to coronavirus and the impact and how many might be in the future, you've also got to take into account the health impact of non-coronavirus diseases like cancer, whose treatment is affected by the actions we've had to take. So my heart goes out to all those who have not been able to get cancer treatment because it wouldn't have been appropriate to do that clinically when there was a virus about. We're putting an enormous amount of effort in now to getting cancer treatment services up and running. Perhaps the most important message, though, and the biggest barrier to more early diagnosis is that people must come forward if they suspect that they may have a cancerous lump. If you find a lump, then please call your GP, and if you're asked to go to hospital, then do. It will be safe to do so, and it's really important that people help us to help them.
We now return to Scotland to visit Drew Hendry. Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, it's vital to have health services fully prepared for the possibility of a second wave of coronavirus, whilst reopening normal health services. So with that in mind, a simple question for the Secretary of State. What estimate has he made of the additional funding required for the NHS between now and the end of 2020?
Well, we're constantly putting more money into the NHS, and we've put a 30 billion extra in over the crisis thus far.
Sir John Redwood.
Could the Secretary of State remind us how big an increase in intensive care capacity there has been now for the health service, which is a great achievement? And were the unthinkable to happen and there was another surge in the virus, could we have isolation hospitals that dealt with that so the rest of the hospitals and surgeries can carry on with their other work?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. We've doubled the intensive care capacity, and alongside the Nightingales, that's been a remarkable achievement of the NHS. There is now a green and blue, as we call it, areas of hospitals, or whole hospitals, depending on the geography. In a rural area, you couldn't turn a whole hospital to be COVID secure, COVID free, because it serves both COVID and non-COVID patients. And that separation of the NHS into blue and green areas is a very important part of them being able to reduce the impact of infection control procedures, which obviously are having a big impact on the provision of services.
Surely A&E may be able to help you with that, Secretary of State. Steve McCabe.
Thank you. What's the current level of funding for research projects into the long-term effects of COVID-19 funded from the National Institute for Health Research, in which I think the government claims to put £1 billion?
Well, this is a really important point, and the honourable gentleman will have heard at the weekend that the NHS has opened a long-term COVID impact service. That's for the health side. On the research side, we've so far put £8.4 million into a research call, but of course we'd be happy to expand that if we get research projects that are worthwhile.
Dr. Liam Fopp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What advice and guidance has been developed for shielded adults who have children of school age? It's not simply a question of the transmission risk between children, but the unavoidable contact with other adults. I'm sure my right honourable friend will understand that the earlier such advice is developed and disseminated, the less unnecessary anxiety there will be for these parents during the school holidays.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'll write to my right honourable friend with that advice, of course, as thankfully as the virus has been brought under control, so the restrictions on those who are shielding are able to be lifted. So I'm glad to say this is a lessening problem. But certainly ahead of September in particular and the full return of schools, we'll have to make sure this advice is very clear, and we'll do that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Day respite care centres such as HomeLink in my constituency provide much needed support for people with dementia, learning difficulties and other complex needs, and they are a lifeline for unpaid carers. HomeLink and others are desperate to open as quickly as possible. They're working on COVID secure guidelines, but they can't get free access to testing for staff and their users. Will he look at making testing for respite care centres available on the same basis as care homes, please?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, we have a project underway on this. It's something that the chair of the Science and Technology Committee has been working on for weeks as well, and again I will write to her with the full details of the plan to make this happen.
Heading to Dr. Luke Evans in Bosworth. Dr. Luke Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Apologies. Can I use this chance to put on record my thanks to the people of Leicester and Leicestershire, and indeed the services themselves, the police, public health, for dealing with the local lockdown that's been implemented. And when it comes to a local lockdown being announced, the people of Hinckley and Bosworth need two pieces of vital information. That is, what are the measures and where is the boundary? When it comes to the measures, the government were quick to put up on their website what those measures are. And when it came to the boundary, the government decided to rightly allow Public Health England and the councils to draw that. So what lessons has the Health Secretary learnt about passing on information quickly, and what lessons has he learnt from the Leicester lockdown that can be used in future lockdowns that may well happen in the rest of the country?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman, my honourable friend, is quite right to praise the work that's been done by Leicestershire County Council as well as by the City Council, with whom we're working hand in glove. And of course, we're looking at the way that the lockdown was brought in at pace in Leicester to ensure that, should we need to do that again, we can make sure that it is a yet more effective process. One of the lessons is that the boundary for the action is a critical piece of information. We managed to publish that within around 12 hours overnight, within about 12 hours of the decision being publicised. And I pay tribute to the County Council who led on that decision. Obviously, making sure that you have both the actions and the boundary ready as soon as possible is critical, because naturally local people immediately want to know whether they're in the lockdown area or out.
We now head to South Yorkshire with Clive Betts. Clive Betts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't know whether the Secretary of State saw today the comments by the President of the Royal Society about the benefits of wearing face masks in indoor public settings, but also drawn attention to the fact that the prevalence of wearing face masks is much less in the UK than it is in Spain or Italy. Could I ask him, therefore, to look at two things? One, would he look at some scheme for issuing a pass or a badge to those who have an exemption from wearing a face mask on public transport, so those who aren't exempt can be required to wear them? And secondly, will you look again at the lack of any advice about wearing face masks in supermarkets and other shops? Because surely it's just as easy to catch the virus in a supermarket queue as it is on a bus.
Steve?
Yes and yes.
Right. On that basis, we'll head up to Derbyshire to Heather Wheeler. Heather Wheeler.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I congratulate my honourable friend for answering this urgent question with the usual aplomb, and also congratulate my friend from Derbyshire Dales asking the question about cancer treatment. It's very important up here in Derbyshire. On that basis, can I ask my right honourable friend about news about opening swimming pools? We've got fantastic swimming clubs in South Derbyshire that really want their kids to get back to swimming. And although I'm very grateful for all the pubs that are open, some families prefer to go to bowling alleys. Wonder whether he's got any news on those two social events being able to open as well, please.
Stay.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would love to get swimming pools open as soon as safely possible. The emphasis, of course, as I know my honourable friend knows, has to be on safely. But alongside gyms, we're working with swimming pools. Of course, there's also some absolutely beautiful open water swimming in Derbyshire, and so I think that. I think swimming in all its form, in the sea, in open water and in swimming pools, is very good for your health, and we should try to get it all open as soon as we possibly can. But the nature of swimming and of changing rooms is that there are risks, and we've got to make sure those risks are properly taken into account.
Let's head to South Wales with Jessica Morden. Jessica Morden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the Secretary of State's earlier comments, will the government back the campaign by Macmillan Cancer Support and commit to urgently publishing a national cancer recovery plan, ensuring that cancer doesn't become the forgotten sea in this pandemic? And will the Secretary of State meet with them to discuss this?
I'd be very happy to meet Macmillan. I know that my honourable friend, the member for Bury St Edmunds, and the minister responsible for cancer has been working on exactly this subject. But I'd be very happy, of course, to meet Macmillan and other cancer charities, because this is such an important thing to get right.
Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State will have received my letter as chair of the APPG for vascular and venous disease, highlighting the suffering that vascular patients are facing because of delayed treatment caused by COVID-19. As I've said before, time is tissue. The longer there is a delay in treatment, the more likely it is that these patients have to have an amputation. So what are the government's plans for addressing this backlog?
Thank you very much. Look, the Honourable Lady is quite right to raise this issue. She's raised it before, and we've been working on it. In the first instance, the best way to tackle this backlog is to get treatments open as much as possible and to get the number of treatments back up to par, if you like. where they were before the crisis, and then we're going to have to work on any backlog. In some areas there are bigger backlogs than in others. And the NHS did a remarkable job during the crisis. We protected it during the crisis, but the NHS has a huge amount of work to do, and we will support it to do that work because of the consequences that have been inevitable and necessary as part of the response to COVID.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week it was revealed that Rotherham had one of the highest rates of infection in the entire country. What reassurances can my right honourable friend, give the people of Rother Valley that it's safe to go out, it's safe to patronise our businesses, and we're getting control of this virus?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's true that Rotherham has a higher proportion of positive cases than the country as a whole. Nevertheless, that rate is much lower than it was in Leicester. And we're working with the council to make sure that the necessary action is taken. I think everybody in the Rother Valley should take comfort in the fact that nationally the virus is under control. In rural parts of Yorkshire, the rate is not that much higher than anywhere else, and people should go out and enjoy summer safely. But the emphasis should be both on enjoy and on safely.
Charlotte Nichols.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the end of March, the Department for Health and Social Care announced that Clipper Logistics would be contracted to provide a portal for community healthcare partners, like local authorities and social care providers, to order PPE for their staff. Can he confirm what the value of the contract awarded to Clipper was, and how many items of PPE it has delivered?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have those figures to hand, but the delivery of PPE through this portal has been a very important part of the response in some parts of the country, and I'm very glad that thanks to incredible hard work of thousands of people, public sector and private, we have managed to deliver now 2 billion items of PPE, and that the very sharp spike in demand for PPE has now been met with a very sharp increase in supply.
Drew Percy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank care home workers in my constituency? I've been called out to patients a number of times in my role in the ambulance service in care homes over this period, and seeing staff in full PPE, lockdown, I'm absolutely full of admiration without the support they normally get from families. So I want to thank them for that. Just very quickly on the issue of nurses. My trust to catch up will require a large number of overseas nurses as well as training new ones. Part 2 of those nurse NMC qualifications have to be completed within 3 months, but some of those test centres are not open yet. So can we look into whether that can be extended or whether we can get these test centres open and the backlog cleared?
Well, yes, Mr. Speaker, the whole House should pay tribute to my honourable friend's work as a first responder during this crisis. He has first-hand experience of the matters of which he speaks. And the particular issue that he's raised is not one that's been previously drawn to my attention, but we are doing everything we can to hire nurses, and we're seeing the results of that. More than 10,000, more than 12,000 more nurses than this time last year in the NHS. Well on our way to the 50,000 more nurses over this Parliament, on which everybody on this side of the House was elected. And I'll look into the particular issues he raises and try to solve the problem.
Heading and returning to Scotland to visit Angus Brendan McNeill. Angus Brendan McNeill.
Mr. Speaker, last week's Panorama had a public health expert from Germany saying that if we only look for people with symptoms, we do not get the whole iceberg, just the tip of it. Now, in Iceland and the Faroe Islands, which have the highest testing in the world of population, between a fifth and a third of the populations actually, they have found as far back as March that 80 to 85% of COVID-19 carriers are asymptomatic. So I can ask the Secretary of State, what strategy does he have to find those people who are asymptomatic? Because we either test and search out the whole iceberg, or we keep using the blunt instrument of lockdowns.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is absolutely right that around 70 to 80% of tests of positive cases in surveys are of people who are asymptomatic. It is one of the most difficult things about this virus. Hence, we have built one of the largest testing capabilities in the world. It is significantly bigger than all of the other major countries bar a small number, and we're using that testing capability for asymptomatic testing as well as, of course, for symptomatic testing across the NHS, across social care, and we're supporting Scotland as much as we possibly can in their testing effort too.
Right, 23 is withdrawn, so we're going to Stella Creasy. Stella Creasy.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has set out how important data is to his strategy. Can he therefore explain why his government has a contract with Deloitte to cover the testing of COVID-19, which does not require Deloitte to report positive cases of COVID-19 to Public Health England or to local authorities?
Because the contract is with the department and the reporting comes through the department.
Robert Gilbert. Does the Secretary of State share my admiration of care workers on the Yorkshire coast, including those in a care home in my constituency where an outbreak amongst admin staff in the office was contained there and not spread to forward-facing staff or residents? But would he also undertake to support local authorities like North Yorkshire County Council, who in the last fortnight have had to close 2 care homes in Scarborough run by the same company, where evidence from the CQC showed that that level of care was unacceptable and potentially dangerous?
Yes, my right honourable friend raises an incredibly important point. I pay tribute to those care homes, both in Scarborough and across the country, who've done the right thing and are tackling outbreaks when they find them, including some who go to extraordinary lengths to protect their residents, not least because we know that care home residents are amongst some of the most vulnerable to coronavirus. But at the same time, we must ensure that the level of care remains high, and the CQC does have an incredibly important role in this.
Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Professor Michael Baker, who formulated New Zealand's world-leading elimination strategy, said that the UK has all the tools it needs to pursue containment and elimination if it chooses to. The alternative is going in and out of lockdown for months, if not years. Does he agree with that, and will he therefore confirm whether the UK government's strategy for COVID-19 is going to be centred on elimination rather than suppression?
Thank you very much. Well, we are absolutely bringing the case rate right down, and the fact that across the UK as a whole there were only 352 positive cases in the last 24-hour period, which is the lowest since before lockdown, demonstrates that that action is happening, and that's why it's because of this action, Mr. Speaker, that we've been able to allow people to have some more of the freedoms to enjoy things that they enjoy. And I'm glad to say that that strategy has been followed by all 4 governments within the UK. Maybe differences in detail and differences within a few days of a few bits of the timing, but essentially this has been a UK-wide strategy followed both by the Labour Welsh Government and by the SNP Government in Scotland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like so many across our country, I was very delighted to visit the pub for the first time over the weekend and had my first pint in a socially distanced fashion at the Durham Ox in Coundon. I was really impressed with Susan and Phil in there for the work that they'd done to enforce social distancing and some of the ingenious measures they put in place, including diligently collecting the contact information of people who entered. So on that note, can my right honourable friend outline how COVID secure guidance from BAYS is helping to support the vital NHS test, track and trace efforts?
Well, this is true, Mr. Speaker. Because of the actions that we've put in place, it means that we can open hospitality like pubs, and doing that safely means that we've been able to open more hospitality than we would otherwise have. I too went for a haircut and a pint on Saturday morning, and the haircut was on Saturday morning, the pint was very early in the afternoon. And I'm glad to say that my name was taken and my phone number was taken when I turned up at the pub. And I haven't been back to Suffolk, though, Mr. Speaker, since February. It's one of the things I've missed most about this whole crisis. And I'm going on Friday, and there I will go to the pub, and no doubt they'll take my number too.
Mr. Speaker, we have heard much in recent weeks about the risks of a second wave. Could the Minister please outline the current science on that, and indeed outline when we might be most at risk?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the policies we've put in place with the local action are precisely targeted to reduce the risk of a second wave nationally. Nevertheless, as we turn to winter and the weather gets colder, there are signs of some seasonality in this virus, meaning that we will have to be much more careful, both because of the potential impact on how easily the virus transmits, but also because of changes of behaviour, because we know outdoors is safer and it's just harder to be outdoors in winter. So we must remain vigilant as a country.
Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the impact of COVID-19 on the beauty industry was raised in this chamber last week, the Prime Minister laughed, and that is despite the fact that it contributes £30 billion to the economy and accounts for 1 in 60 jobs. So can I ask the Secretary of State, further to the question of the honourable gentleman, what engagement the government has had with this sector, and given that hairdressers and pubs are now open, when can beauty salons expect to open too?
Mr. Speaker, the decisions that we've taken are based on clinical advice and clinical advice on the risk, because we know that face-to-face is more high risk than not being face-to-face if you're in close contact. That's been the basis on which the decisions have been taken. Of course, I understand the impact on the beauty industry, and as I said earlier, my right honourable friend, the Business Secretary, is leading on this issue, and will make progress when we safely can.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I visited St Giles School in Retford, who very kindly gave me one of their excellent cloth face coverings to wear when travelling to Parliament. Will my right honourable friend join me in reiterating that while cloth face coverings can help reduce the risk of transmission in some circumstances, face masks worn as part of PPE for healthcare and other workers should be reserved for those who need it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the use of face coverings that are not formal face masks is valuable, especially in some circumstances, and therefore it's mandated on public transport, and it has been long recommended in some shops. The use of masks, and especially the high-end masks, should be reserved for those who need them in clinical settings. However, I'm also glad to say that the supply of PPE is now much, much more secure than it was a couple of months ago, and that means that face masks are more readily and widely available and are increasingly used in non-clinical settings for the low-end surgical masks, which are the ones that you would typically use if you were in a non-clinical setting. Nevertheless, face coverings are an incredibly important part of our armoury.
31 withdrawn, so going straight to Caroline Notes. Caroline Notes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. People working in aesthetics, the professionals who tattoo on eyebrows to alopecia sufferers or tattoo on the nipples of cancer patients who've had reconstructive surgery, have been horrified to discover they are categorised alongside strip clubs. Will my right honourable friend please look at this issue urgently to understand how the NHS is referring patients to these people who are still not allowed to open?
I'll certainly look into that last point. I would just say though that that categorisation isn't quite right. They're not the beauty industry is an important industry in and of its own right. And whilst we still do have restrictions in certain areas and categories, that doesn't mean that they should all be lumped in together. They are incredibly important. The beauty industry is an incredibly important industry, and we will get it open as soon as it's safe to do so.
We're heading up to Greater Manchester to visit Barbara Keeley. Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the start of this crisis, the guidance for care homes was unclear. They couldn't get PPE, and patients were being discharged from hospital to care homes without being tested for COVID. Now, the Prime Minister's comments have given offence. So does the Secretary of State accept that care home providers cannot be blamed for the deaths of their residents, and that it's time to give care staff the pay and respect they deserve, and bring forward plans to fund social care properly?
Mr. Speaker, the need to reform social care is no less urgent than before the crisis, and indeed we've learned through the crisis yet more about the nature of the reforms needed, because we've seen the positive impact of much closer system-level working between the NHS and social care and indeed local authorities, and that should inform our thinking about the long-term social care reforms that this country needs to see.
34 withdrawn, so we go straight to Jim Shannon.
Can I first of all thank the Secretary of State very much for all he's done, his leadership and his direction and courage as well. Macmillan Research estimates that disruption to normal cancer services could see almost 2,000 cases of cancer a week going undiagnosed, with almost half of the cancer patients seeing their cancer treatment delayed, cancelled or changed as a result of coronavirus. Given this level of disruption, what additional resources will the Secretary of State put in place to protect and sustain the delivery of cancer care if further waves of the pandemic should occur?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman has repeatedly raised this vital question. I think he was the first in this House to raise the importance of restarting cancer services right at the peak of the pandemic. We've been working incredibly hard to do so. And of course, we've put in extra funding this year into the NHS in very, very large sums because of the crisis. And of course, we want to see cancer services fully restored as safely as possible. And I just repeat the point I made to my honourable friend from Derbyshire earlier, which is it's critical that people come forward if they suspect that they might have cancer.
Right. Sir, Hampshire Hospitals Foundation Trust, as the Health Secretary knows, are currently doing a big engagement process called Hampshire Together, which will look at the future of health services, not just in the acute sector, over the next 30, 40 years. This is a critical piece of work going on throughout June and throughout the rest of July. My constituents at the moment, understandably, are emerging from a pandemic. Many are worried whether they'll be still within furlough in a few months' time, let alone thinking about the next 40 years of health services. Can I ask the Health Secretary to be minded to big decisions being taken now while the public are understandably distracted?
I take my honourable friend's point and take it very seriously. We're planning significant investment into the health service in Hampshire. That has to be done in a way that enhances services locally in Winchester and across the county. And we've learned a huge amount about how the health system works best during COVID. The system working much more community activity and much more treatment at home by telemedicine, which has been one of the things that has gone incredibly well in this crisis.
Let us return to Scotland and drop in on Martin Day. Martin Day.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Polling from YouGov has shown that the so-called anti-vaccination sentiment is on the increase in the UK, with 16% of UK adults saying they would probably or definitely avoid a COVID-19 vaccine. So what does the Secretary of State feel this means for the hopes of achieving immunity?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The government of the United Kingdom will recommend a vaccine as soon as one is available that is safe, but only when it is safe. And it is so important and incumbent on every single member of this House that we make the case for why vaccines are both safe and effective. I think that the honourable gentleman is absolutely right to raise this issue. I'm grateful to him for doing so. This is an issue, I think, on which all parties agree. And as should a vaccine come off, it will be such good news for humanity, frankly, that we need to make sure that then people are given the support and the confidence and, of course, the logistical convenience to be able to get a vaccine, should that be clinically appropriate.
Felicity Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend consider a comprehensive review of Public Health England to see what lessons can be learnt and what future improvements can be made for any future crises?
Well, we're constantly learning what we can do to improve the response to coronavirus. We've been clear about that right from the start. And for instance, the gathering evidence on asymptomatic transmission that we saw during March and April is a case in point, because it then changed policy and how we deal with this virus.
39 withdrawals will go to Alan Kearns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The welcome opening of pubs in England has made a major difference to the morale of a nation. In Wales, pubs won't be able to open until next Monday, and then only outside. Will my right honourable friend share the best practice of one-way systems, appropriate screening, to ensure that landlords, pubs and breweries don't go out of business needlessly if only Wales follow the English model?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I'm very happy to work with my Welsh colleagues on how it's possible to open pubs and hospitality in a COVID-secure and safe way. Wales has a great tradition of great pubs, and I very much hope that they can be open as soon as the Welsh Government makes their decision.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I remind the Secretary of State about another virus, HIV? And as chair of the All-Party Group on HIV and AIDS, I've been meeting with other colleagues from across the House and across both houses this morning to hear about the impact that the COVID-19 crisis has had on people living with HIV in terms of mental health, access to treatment, many other issues, and of course the disproportionate impact on the Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. Can he say what he's been doing specifically to support people with HIV, but also would one of his ministers meet with our group to listen to some very specific concerns that we have?
Well, yes, this is an incredibly important issue. Our goal as a country to reach no transmissions of HIV by 2030 stands unaffected by COVID. Of course, it is a vital objective, and there's a huge amount of support and effort behind that goal. The access to treatment, of course, has been made more challenging. Naturally, and if you think about it, Mr. Speaker, we talk about this epidemic and think about it as being the biggest since the Spanish flu, but it's not, because the biggest epidemic before this one was the HIV epidemic, which we are still working to rid the world of. But I have every hope that in our lifetimes we will get there, and we will play our part.
Mr. Speaker, people in Broxton have written to me about their fears that due to lockdown, their mental health has declined and vital treatment, including therapy, has been postponed. The coronavirus has made them more anxious to seek help, and like many, I'm worried about the impact a lack of early intervention can have on vulnerable people. Can my right honourable friend reassure me that mental health support will be part of the NHS's Open campaign, and people concerned about their mental health can safely seek help?
Yes, mental health services absolutely are open, and people who need support with mental ill health should come forward. They should go to their GP in the first instance. The good news in this area is that telemedicine is particularly effective for psychiatry. Of course, it can't be effective for all mental illnesses, but it can for many, and is being used very, very effectively by psychiatrists across the country.
Let's head to Bedford and visit Mohammed Yazin. Mohammed Yazin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The initial findings of the investigation into Bedford's now decreased infection rate shows that women between 30 to 59 have been most affected. Can the Secretary of State remind everyone that this invisible virus does not just affect the older generation? And does he agree that the published data must include details on ethnicity, older generation, and workplace factors if we are to eliminate the virus and keep the public safe?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. We are increasingly publishing more and more data about this virus and who's caught it, in the same way that we're increasingly giving more and more information to Directors of Public Health so that they can use it for the same purposes. He's quite right to say that this virus does not only affect those who are older, although more people who are older tend to die from the disease. Anybody can transmit it, and that is the big risk. I'm glad to say that the numbers of cases in Bedford are coming down, and we keep a watchful eye to ensure that that continues to be the case.
44 withdrawn, so we go to David Linden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, coronavirus has impacted all of us, but one such group that's been impacted are the parents of premature and sick babies, and I would commend to the Secretary of State the briefing paper from Bliss that parents aren't visitors. Would the Secretary of State be willing to meet with myself as chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on premature and sick babies, as well as Bliss, to look at the impact that this has had on the parents of premature and sick babies and ensure that they get the support they need to support their families at this time?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I would be very happy to meet him and the group. This is an incredibly important issue. It's one that's very close to my heart. I think many in this House will know that one of our members lost premature twins very recently. It's something that affects many, many families, and we must ensure that the services are available, NHS services are available, to give premature babies the very best chance in life.
Andrew Jones.
Speaker, screening programmes help keep people healthy, and indeed this government has expanded them. As the NHS communicates it's open and that people should seek treatment, will my right honourable friend ensure its leaders focus on getting screening programmes back up to full speed and then encourage people to use them and get screened?
I'm really glad that my right honourable friend has raised this point, because screening services are so important, including for cancer, a subject that's been raised many times in this session and in the House in general, Mr. Speaker. We're working very hard to expand and reopen screening services, making sure that infection control is possible and using testing effectively so that when people come forward for screening, they can do so with confidence. So my right honourable friend is quite right to raise this, and we'll keep pushing it, because screening is so important to keeping people healthy.
Tim Farron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last night's Panorama programme, of course, showed the awful truth that we could lose more people to cancer due to delayed treatments and interventions than we do to COVID-19 itself. We know we can avoid this tragedy in a number of ways, one of which, of course, is to expand the operation and to bring forward the implementation of radiotherapy around the country. This summer, especially, to clear the backlog and to give people hope, including delivery close to home in places like the Westmorland General Hospital in Kendal. Would he meet with the all-party group on radiotherapy to discuss our 6-point plan to help to give people hope to save lives immediately and in the long term?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we share a common mission in this space. Because we've already invested £200 million in expanding diagnostics, and this is an incredibly important part of the reopening of the NHS. So I'm very, very happy to meet with him and his group and all those interested in expansion of not just radiography but all types of diagnostics. Because making sure that we do that in a way that works for patients and therefore opens access is incredibly important. We're putting in the investment, we're rolling out the programme, it's happening as we speak, and if he's got further ideas to throw into that area, I'm very happy to listen to them.
Final question, Richard Gray.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the Secretary of State and all involved, first for the temporary and now for the permanent testing site available for the people of Gloucestershire in Gloucester. But the reality is that the capacity is much greater than demand and resources are considerable. So does my right honourable friend agree that we could make this testing capacity available, for example, to teachers with concerns or to members of BAME communities who need reassurance much faster before symptoms develop? How could we make this happen?
Mr. Speaker, I'm absolutely thrilled to get a question on the problem of having too much testing capacity as opposed to too little. We have one of the biggest testing capacities in the world. We've built that almost from scratch as a country, and we must use it effectively. So we have, for instance, rolled out the extra testing in the NHS that the chair of the Select Committee was asking about earlier. We've rolled out the weekly testing of staff and monthly testing of patients in care homes. We will follow a clinical path. So for teachers that he asked about, Mr. Speaker, we are currently survey testing teachers to find out if they are more at risk than the general population, in the same way that care workers, care home workers and NHS staff are. And if they are, then we will put asymptomatic testing in place. We're doing exactly the same for taxi drivers, Mr. Speaker, because taxi drivers are at higher risk than the rest of the country, and so we're doing the survey testing. So if he will forgive me, we're taking a scientific approach to how we allocate that capacity, but it is true that one of the policy challenges we face as a department is making sure that we use all of the testing capacity, and long may that be so.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I am now suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order!